I'm not joking, my hands hurt as I began to write down my thoughts for this video. I spent the entirety of last weekend playing Spider-Man on the PS4. It took a couple of late nights, but here I was, having beaten a game and acquired the Platinum Trophy. There are only a few games each year that can do this to me, and that says something. I've had an absolute blast. Now, something that you may already know about me is that I'm generally not a fan of the superhero genre. Aside from a few exceptions like The Dark Knight and Logan, I've never truly felt attached to the popular movie franchises that the world does seem to love. It's hard to exactly pinpoint why that is, but the idea just never appealed to me, and I get tired quickly of all the spectacle if there isn't a story that I personally care for to make it all worthwhile. I'm aware I don't hold the popular opinion, and that's completely fine. But here is the thing, superhero games have always been an exception to the rule for me. Batman Arkham Knight, the infamous series, I've played quite a few of these games and enjoyed them every single time. The idea of playing as such powerful characters, giving you the opportunity to use their superpowers freely, works so much better for me here than in the passive forms of entertainment. It's a concept that can result in some of the most fun, over-the-top and satisfying gameplay out there. Spider-Man on PS4 proves this more than ever. With over 20 hours on the clock in just a single weekend, it's easy for me to summarize how I feel about the game. Spider-Man on PS4 is not flawless, it's not original in any way, but man is it fun. Fans of the series have had to wait so long for a great new Spider-Man game that the main intention was obviously to make sure this is what Insomniac would deliver. I want to explore a slightly different style of reviewing games that goes even more in depth, and therefore I've decided calling this a critique makes a bit more sense. In this video I will extensively discuss my thoughts with you all to talk about every facet of the game. Naturally, that means the areas in which it excels, but also includes a more critical emphasis on the flaws and whether, in my opinion, they have a large or small impact on the game's overall quality. To keep in mind those of you still looking to beat or pick up the game, I've decided to keep this entire video spoiler free on my own terms. I've carefully picked gameplay scenes that don't show too much, and while I will discuss the story in broader terms, I'll do so without giving important details away. With all of that being said, let's get into it. What I like about Spider-Man is that it immediately throws you in. After a short 2-minute cutscene, you're freely traversing through New York, while the game begins to teach you the core mechanics. The web slinging is obviously one of the key parts of a Spider-Man game, and it instantly feels great. I was surprised that there was quite a learning curve in almost every gameplay element, and that includes the exploration. I initially bumped into buildings quite often, which slowed down my momentum. As stupid as it sounds now, being used to all these other superhero games out there, it sometimes made me wish Spider-Man had the ability to simply float in the sky. But in no time I became familiar with what and what definitely not to do. Fly in between buildings, use the X button to extend airtime. It takes a few hours to truly master these mechanics. Best of all though, I was happy to see that as you level up, your sling speed actually increases. In the early phases I already liked the fluidity, but fast forward to now, it feels so amazing and fast that I wouldn't want it any other way. Now excuse me in advance for the inevitable amount of times I'm gonna be comparing Spider-Man to other games out there, mainly the Batman Arkham series, because it's absolutely clear a lot of inspiration was taken from titles like these. Like I stated in the intro, it's evident that Insomniac, still relatively new to open world games, took a deep look at what it was that made those games great and applied a lot of it here. The combat system is one of the biggest examples. Fighting generally feels fluent, using a button layout that I was already more than used to. The basis is formed by the face buttons for the hand-to-hand combat and shoulder buttons for extra gadgets or interacting with the environment. Every other advanced action essentially builds off of this. I almost immediately felt at home and started experimenting with how far I could take these mechanics. Jump over a guy with a shield, kick him up in the air, finish him off and hit triangle to sling directly towards the next one. Combat forms one of the biggest parts of the entire game, so I was glad to see how satisfying, fast and responsive it felt. Now, that doesn't mean I think it's perfect though. In my opinion, the trap that Spider-Man falls for is that as you get further and further into the story, stronger factions do get introduced, but the difficulty is raised mostly by putting more enemies on screen. I don't think that necessarily helps you optimize your approach to combat at all. There came a point where I would get targeted by so many rifle lasers and surrounding bad guys that I'd constantly be ready to hit the dodge button or heal myself via the D-pad. It barely gave me the time to fight back other than by just spamming the square button, which seems highly counterintuitive considering the reason this combat system got introduced was to take away from simple button mashing to win fights. I would rarely resort to the gadgets or throwing objects in the environment anymore because of the amount of time and precision this would take. The move list is such an extensive one that I also forgot or simply stopped caring about specific possibilities. Occasionally I'd be reminded that my suit power had been ready to go all this time, but I didn't realize it. The situation was just too hectic. I suppose it's a weird thing to complain about, but I think I should at least acknowledge that this is the case. There is a reason why this stood out to me, and it's because this isn't the only time I noticed an unnecessary amount of possibilities. The design choices in progression reflect this situation once more. I'm not someone who cares for customization at all, but I'm sure many fans are happy with the amount of available suits for Spider-Man. Many games would tie a specific suit power to the outfit itself, but this game lets you combine them to your preference, which is great. The list of powers and mods is huge, and I was happy to see that they are all pretty useful. But then again, I noticed that certain ones are so similar to others that I was honestly left thinking, why do they even exist at all? Here is a power that electrifies enemies, this one increases your strength, here are some iron arms that deal more damage, and this one uses ethereal energy. Really, it all comes down to the same thing, the only difference is the visual look. Spider-Man does this over and over. It makes you think the sky's the limit, but in reality it's all pretty artificial. There is a leveling system which makes you feel like you're always making progress, that no matter what you decide to do, you're gonna be rewarded for it with new stuff. But that's simply not the truth when the XP you gather by completing main missions far outweighs the XP gathered from everything else. It ultimately means that despite making you think straying off the main path won't slow down your ability to advance, the real progression you make is still mostly dependent on whether you continue the story. Again, I know it sounds nitpicky to complain about unnecessary features rather than actual faults. Honestly, it should tell you how great the gameplay actually is, but it doesn't take away that I felt a little misled by it all. Insomniac is known for their Ratchet & Clank series, which I'm a huge fan of, and I felt the DNA of the company the moment I was introduced to the puzzles for the first time. To switch things up, the game adds variety through things like these small challenges. There are two types of puzzles available, Spectrograph and Circuit Projects, the latter of which I definitely enjoyed the most. The puzzles in the story are purposefully made easy in order to keep the pace up, and I totally get that. If you're up for more, the lab also offers some additional variants, though here I wish those had been a bit more difficult than they were, because I for one really enjoyed solving them. There are also a handful of stealth sections, which you play with other characters like Mary Jane. Towards the end, they can become a bit of a chore with how restrictive and basic they are. Essentially, they only limit you in your options rather than giving you something new to play with, but for the most part, they last just short enough to make you appreciate the distraction nonetheless.
Hey, who's there?
Wait!
Insomniac's games have always had a great track record when it comes to presentation, and Spider-Man is no different. There is only one word to describe the graphics: the game looks beautiful. New York feels alive, full of people walking the streets and cars stuck in traffic jams. The amount of conversations, whether through cutscenes, in-game or simply over the radio, helped to continuously keep me engaged. So much so that it often frustrated me when the dialogue would cut out because I was forced to stand still in a room in order to keep listening. One of the details that especially impressed me was how, while climbing up a building, I was able to look through the windows, seeing the office spaces or living rooms inside. The technology that's used for that is impressive, though not perfect. Rooms are repeated all the time, and you can often see the same objects from several angles when you shouldn't be able to. It seems a certain trick was applied to make this work, but you have to deliberately look for these imperfections to spot them. Then there is the draw distance, which is insane. Go up on one of the tallest buildings and you can essentially see the entire map in front of you. The day-night cycle is not organic, which seems more like a design choice which is tied to the story. Peter Parker leads his own life in which he's regularly forced to swap between his two lifestyles, so it makes perfect sense. I only have two major gripes when it comes to the presentation. First of all, and this is certainly not rare to open world games, but there are more than a few bugs.
Yuri.
Spider-Man. Hello? Is this working?
Dr. Michaels? How are...
You're a lot shorter than I thought.
Yuri.
At one point, a glitch caused an annoying buzzing sound that didn't go away, forcing me to reload my save file. The character models in a cutscene bugged out briefly, and afterwards I witnessed Spider-Man spectacularly taking out a guy for me, but then I looked up only to visually see him vanish in thin air. All of this happened to me within the span of about 15 minutes in just a single story mission, which should tell you that these moments aren't rare. Only a few issues truly interrupted my experience, but I definitely feel the game needed a bit more polish. I took on a base fight to get to the 6th and final round, only to find out an enemy got stuck in a container object and I had to do the same thing all over again. Last of all, while I haven't experienced any myself, I've heard from others that the game has crashed on them quite a few times. Hopefully, most of these problems will or have already been resolved by a patch. My second gripe is something I don't often say, but I was disappointed with the music. Don't get me wrong, what's there sounds great, but it's like every impactful moment constantly relied on the same theme playing over and over. Insomniac had some really neat ideas in mind. It was such a motivating moment the first time I jumped off a roof to hear the music build up. But again, that effect was lost on me the 50th or 100th time that followed, as I repeatedly heard the same identical tune. It's the small touches, but had these been worked out a little better, the effect could have been so much greater. Oddly enough, the soundtrack has yet to be released in its full form, which should be a sign, considering Sony does this at the launch of their big games all the time. A release of this caliber certainly deserves some extra work to add more variety in its musical score.
So, should we kiss now? Yeah, maybe later.
It took me 13 hours to beat Spider-Man on the regular difficulty mode, spending little time exploring the world. In retrospect, that may have been somewhat of a bad decision. I thoroughly enjoyed playing through the story, quite frankly I felt like I couldn't stop. And I still had a fun time afterwards on the road to achieving my platinum trophy, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of it that felt like a chore. The side content is ultimately the most disappointing aspect of this game for me. Spider-Man doesn't just use the predictable open world formula, it does so to a T. There is no real depth or reason behind these meaningless activities, they merely exist to increase the number of gameplay hours before you're truly done, a stat purely used as a marketing tool. Can I blame the company for it? Only partially. After all, it's simply a response to the demands of a large group of gamers. Personally though, I'd have much rather seen the story expanded by another quarter, or add less side content with more meaning, than see development time going towards something that to me honestly doesn't add anything. Not to turn this into a personal rant, but if you know me, you know that I'm tired of this constant obsession. Having said that, some of it was a welcome addition. The side quests aren't too plentiful, but provide additional storylines that are somewhat worth experiencing. The research stations offer a new twist every time, and clearly some thought was at least put into them. For example, one time you may lose your ability to swing, while another time you avoid getting struck by lightning in an attempt to connect radio towers. Finally, there's the Taskmaster Challenges that genuinely tested my skills and made me want to get better in order to improve my score. Everything else though feels rather stale. The towers that make parts of the map visible are so outdated, even Ubisoft stopped putting them into their games. Collecting backpacks could have been a great invitation to explore, but marking them on the map pinpoints the exact location where to look, essentially turning them into mere fetch missions. Making photos of landmarks was slightly more entertaining, seeing as you could pull out your camera in midair, taking pictures from a distance while in slow motion. The bases are your typical common encounters with several waves of enemies, and the pigeons require you to chase them down for just a minute before you can catch them. It helps that the core gameplay is at least a lot of fun, making these objectives feel like simple distractions. Now here's what I did mind though, the crimes. Random encounters have been a thing for a long time. Games like GTA and Red Dead Redemption have made them mainstream and become standard features in most open world games today. But here's the thing, random events are infinite. There is no reason to put a required number on them if you're gonna keep spawning them anyway. Not only does Spider-Man make them part of the objective, it requires you to do a total of, I kid you not, 165 of them. Half of my time spent on side content was to roam the city aimlessly, waiting for a new event to appear out of the sky, just so I could fight another group of bad guys for the so manyth time. Having spent my last 15 hours or so obtaining 100% completion, I can't help but say it left me with a bit of a sour aftertaste.
I'm winning.
Get this guy checked for dementia, Pete. I'm crushing him.
Well, the important thing is having fun.
The side content definitely doesn't set this game apart, but against my expectations, it's the story at heart that makes Spider-Man shine. As someone who doesn't care for superheroes, you have to understand I don't say that lightly. Regardless of whether Marvel fans would have been satisfied by it, I never thought I'd care for it much. Fortunately, this is the area even I was left surprised. One of my main problems with most movies, and superhero movies in particular, is a lack of depth in character arcs. Due to the limited time available and the big emphasis that's already put on the spectacle, most characters usually stay the same from beginning to end. Essentially, you constantly switch between scenarios, rather than being able to see the details, the stuff that happens in between. That doesn't apply so much here. Peter Parker gets his own personal story, one that's easy to relate to and filled with its ups and downs. A limited list of allies as well as villains granted this game the time and focus to flesh most of them out and truly evolve across the 13-hour journey. One thing I've never quite understood about this genre is how light-hearted it often pretends to be. I mean, there are literal terrorist organizations roaming the streets, people should be frightened, but the mood is normally neutral, while most superheroes can't help to crack a joke every opportunity they get. I thought it was another thing this game handled well. There were particular scenes I found surprisingly brutal and actually showed how serious these situations are. Next up, there is how new characters are introduced, which is done in such smart ways. You meet particular people who will play a relatively large role, but not even realize he or she only serves as a bridge that connects you to a brand new character. Every time the game transitions between who you play as, it does so in organic ways that left me super impressed. My only real issue is that as a story on its own, most of it is pretty predictable. There are characters you meet in the beginning that I just knew I would have to ultimately face, and lo and behold I did. Boss fights are generally lacking in the first half, but the complete opposite is true for the later parts. The final hours of this game are absolutely phenomenal. They make for some epic set pieces and often require a combination of skills you've learned to take them down. The ending is also fantastic. It was an emotional conclusion and I felt it. Yes, a sequel may already be teased, but that doesn't take away that this narrative felt complete, as the storylines started in the beginning were wrapped up in the end. There is something special to be said for a game that manages to get better and better, and Spider-Man does that. To top it all off, there is some great fan service that gamers who love Marvel will no doubt go nuts over.
Parker! Dr. Octavius, what you got there?
Chinese. If I know you'd be here, I would have... What are you working on?
Oh, just a side project. Of course. It's you. I don't know what you're...
Oh, come on, Parker, it's obvious.
Let me explain.
I only wish you'd told me sooner.
I wanted to, but I was afraid that if word got out, my family might be in danger.
Yes. I guess if you design his equipment, you're bound to be a target too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't worry. Your secret's safe.
In the end, Spider-Man on PS4 is a roller coaster ride that does all but slow down. With a surprisingly emotional and engaging personal story, I felt more invested than I could have possibly hoped for. Regardless of that, the amount of bugs and a few strange and unnecessary design choices do ensure this is not a flawless game though. Furthermore, the side content is little more than typical run-of-the-mill stuff, certainly not making this the most original game either. Despite all that, it's the gameplay that a Spider-Man game needs to nail, and it does that very well. Slinging through New York and fighting bad guys is something so fun that you simply don't get tired of it. Spider-Man is a great game that I would recommend to any PS4 owner. Personally, calling it one of my favorite games this generation would go a step too far, but I would definitely place it among the ranks of a Horizon and Batman Arkham Knight as one of the best traditional open world games available right now. Thanks everybody for watching this video on Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4. It took a little while to get it out in time, but I hope that by now, whether you've beaten the game already or yet have to play it, that you enjoyed listening to my thoughts, because I had quite some stuff to say about it. With that being said, of course, it would be awesome if you could support me. You can do that by leaving a like on the video or going over to patreon.com/robingaming, where you can help me out with just $1 per month or more if you can miss it, and in return, you'll get some really cool rewards, like for example, early access to videos like these, my monthly Q&A, and a lot more really cool stuff. So with that being said, let me know what you thought about the game. I'd love to discuss some more about it with you all in the comments. And then for now, I'd like to thank you a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.